an international affairs expert with a focus on climate and energy and national security. Dr. Mathews is a Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Fellow and has served as its president for 18 years. She's held jobs in the executive and legislative branches of our government. She has served on the editorial board of the Washington Post, and a bit closer to home, she is the chair of the Piedmont Journalism Foundation. Today, we're also joined by our veteran journalist, Lou Emerson. He will lead the conversation with Dr. Mathews, which will cover all those topics and more. That's what these Sundays are about, a chance to get to know the experts, artists, authors, educators who live in Fauquier County and make and enrich our lives. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mathews and Lou Emerson.
Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you, Dr. Mathews, for agreeing to do this. Obviously, an interesting time in international affairs. You will have an opportunity to ask questions later in the program, so please be thinking about that. I can't begin to cover the subject matter here. I think the logical thing to do is for me just to shut up and let you talk about what's top of mind for you these days. What are you most concerned with as we speak?
You know, I used to write a column for the Washington Post, and I had a rule for myself that I would always try to end with something constructive. What do you do about the problem that I had just written about? I'm not sure I can do that today. But I will just share with you my answer to that question, which is, I am terrified. I have thought for a long time that that the biggest problems in national security and in international affairs were domestic, that they stemmed from the extreme polarization of our society that had neutered Congress and that had made it just about impossible to follow a coherent straight line in foreign policy. But the events of the last 3 weeks really bring a completely new dimension to all the things I'm scared about at home. We have an 80-year period since the end of World War II of there were big mistakes in it, obviously. There were some gigantic hiccups, there were some real horrors, but there were, within a certain broad stretch, both parties followed a very consistent structure that was created at the end of World War II, whose principles were no more getting territory by force. And that was, of course, I should mention, tomorrow is the 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. No more acquiring territory by force. International affairs ruled by a constantly thickening layer of international law, and a powerful Western alliance by Western meant liberal democratic governments, elected democratic governments that shared a commitment to democracy. And though, I mean, there was more. There was a belief the U.S. put forward that fostering economic growth in other countries would redound to our benefit, which it certainly did. But still, those 3 things were the core of an international policy that neither the Republicans nor the Democrats at any time ever questioned. In the last 3 weeks, Trump has thrown out all of them. All of them. He has openly talked about acquiring territory by some magical force majeure, whether it's Greenland or Panama or Gaza or Ukraine, for that matter. He has talked about there is a meeting every year in Munich, which is kind of the place where the Western Alliance, but also others, gather at the foreign minister level, experts, scholars. It's a very serious, kind of intense 2.5 days of very serious talking. And Vance went and gave a speech in which he made it clear that he and Trump have switched sides. He talked about the greatest threat to Europe being the enemy within, that European governments stifle free speech, that the government of Ukraine was a dictatorship, and on and on and on. I won't. But connected to what Trump has said, we have switched sides. We are now in a tacit alliance with Russia, a dictatorship, a brutal dictatorship, and we are seen now in Europe by top levels of government as adversaries. This is, and we are, you can see the threads of a plan to dismantle NATO from within. He doesn't have to get out of NATO. He can disembowel it from inside. This meeting with Putin to talk about a peace deal for Ukraine, to which the Ukrainians were not invited, or the Europeans, who have given more money than we have, supporting Ukraine. What we don't know is what he's offering Putin as part of this deal. Putin has said he wants NATO troops out of all of the former Soviet Union. At this point, that's, I believe, the majority of countries in NATO. It's all the Baltics, it's Poland, it's Hungary, it's Romania, it's Slovakia, it's Slovenia, it's the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, on and on. Once you have said that the war in Ukraine was caused by Ukraine, which he has now said on several occasions, there's, I'm sorry, I'm still kind of mind-boggled by this. We have in 2 weeks really switched sides after 80 years of a foreign policy that no one in the foreign policy establishment writ large has ever questioned, which is that our natural allies are the democratically elected governments of Western Europe and Australia, New Zealand, and the parts of Asia, etc. And all of a sudden, Putin is our ally. And then what happened Friday night at the Defense Department, it just bears mentioning because obviously there are two things that keep our gigantic military establishment on track. One is civilian leadership, but the other is that the military recognizes that its loyalty is not to the president but to the Constitution and is rigidly apolitical. So Trump has just done two things. One, he's fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and another one of the chiefs for no reason except one is black and one is a woman. And he has appointed a guy who is not qualified. He's retired. He's a 3-star, not a 4-star. He doesn't have any of the career accomplishments that would qualify him to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or to be a chief, forget chairman. And the only thing that he has going for him is that he once, in uniform, did something illegal, which is put on a MAGA hat. And this is really important, he fired the JAGs, the senior judiciary individuals in the military services. And it's important because there has always been a debate about whether a president alone could start a nuclear war. And that debate has been carried on at the very highest level. People, at the level of Secretary of Defense and 4-star generals have debated this question. And one view is, no, he couldn't, because it is not legal for the military to follow an illegal order. And who decides whether it's an illegal order? The JAGs, the people who Trump has just fired. So, just say one more thing and then I'll stop. This last summer, the guy who was Trump's last national security advisor in the first administration, an individual named O'Brien, wrote an article in the major foreign policy journal in which he advocated that the U.S. should return to nuclear testing after 32 years. This would be an extraordinarily stupid move. I mean, there really is no other way to describe it. We have done more than 1,000 nuclear tests. There's nothing more we can learn from 1,001, from the next nuclear test. The Chinese have done about 50. What keeps them from doing more is the international program that would attach to breaking the international moratorium on testing. If the U.S. broke the moratorium on testing and shouldered that program, the Chinese would be testing in 10 minutes. And after that, there will be nothing holding back a whole lot of other countries, and we'll be back to where we were in the 1950s. I have been told, and I give it credence, that a willingness to say that an individual supported a return to nuclear testing was one of the questions, was a litmus test question in interviews that have been done for senior DoD posts and all that stuff. So you put all that together, and I'll return to where I started, where I thought the principal thing we had to be most scared of was the loss of our democracy domestically. I now think also, I mean, that the risks of what could happen internationally, of what things that were just utterly unthinkable 3 weeks ago. You could not have worked 10 minutes, in fact, you don't need to have worked 10 minutes in the international affairs field to read Vance's speech in Munich and kind of go, is this a joke? These are our allies. These are our closest allies for 80 years, well, for a good deal longer than that for most of them. So that's where we are. So you ask, what I'm most scared of, and I'm scared of tomorrow.
Hypothetical, and I hope it's not an unfair hypothetical. Susie Wiles, White House Chief of Staff, calls you and says, President Trump will give you a private audience for 1 hour. What would you say to him? What would you ask of him? Would you go?
It's a very good question. My guess is, I'd probably go and regret it. Because, it would probably feel completely wrong to say, I'm not even interested in meeting with the President of the United States, but I think it would be pointless. Because everybody I know who worked in the first administration, especially women, I'm sorry to say, because it's not something I usually do, but it is true that women who worked in the White House in policy jobs had a really, really, really hard time. I think I might pick one discrete issue that, like nuclear testing, where maybe he wasn't dug in yet. I mean, things like tariffs and other things would be pointless. But I truly don't, from what I could tell, he's focused. He's pushed an awful lot of the policy under Musk, and he's focused on personal revenge. Petty stuff like, the being chairman of the Kennedy Center. It just, what do you say to somebody like that?
And you've written many times, I believe, that we've reached a point where the only thing that gets our attention is war. That in terms of dealing with domestic issues and many of the other things that have held us back, we just don't pay attention. Anyway.
What's hard, I was saying this to somebody before we started, that and I don't know how many people in this room are like me, I cannot read the news every day anymore. And for the first time in my life.
Most of the people here can't watch the news.
Yeah.
And many just read the headlines.
That's basically, I read things Friends Britain, and that's about all I can stomach. But if we're all doing that, we're leaving the field to them. So somehow we will all have to crawl out of our holes and find a way to. Here you asked for green shoots. Here are a few green shoots. One is there are a huge number of contradictions in his policies, internal contradictions, especially in economic policies. An awful lot of what he's doing is inflationary, of what he is committed to doing is inflationary, highly inflationary, and he has said he's going to bring inflation down. And there are other ways in which I think many of his policies are going to hit, a brick wall of contradiction. Here's another, barely a snowdrop. If you look at what he did in the first term with North Korea and Afghanistan, well, Afghanistan, this so-called peacemaking with the Russians on Ukraine is an exact copy of what he did on Afghanistan, where he negotiated a deal with the Taliban without the government of Afghanistan at the table. Okay, so now you're going to negotiate a peace deal, without the victim government, the invaded government at the table. If there is a deal that could be made, it's not going to, it can't hold any more than the Afghanistan deal did. The other thing to look at is North Korea. So this may be a green shoot. You remember, he started by an enormous amount of bluster. My button is bigger than your button. You're going to see fire and fury like you've never seen before. Da, 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 da. Really inflammatory, scary stuff that sounded like World War III. Then, symmetry and love affair. Kim Jong-un and I love each other, and he wrote me these beautiful letters, da 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 da. We're going to have these 2 meetings, and nothing came out of the sun. Nothing. And he lost interest completely. Just walked away from the issue. It seems to me possible that that he may do the same thing with, although it's a lot harder to walk away from Putin. But from this, you know, he in a way he had to do something, because you remember he promised he was going to end that war before Inauguration Day. And then it was going to be one day after Inauguration Day. So he had to do something that looked like he was doing it. So one could imagine, if one had some happy juice, that he would, you know, have these meetings and it would get a lot of attention, and he and Putin would, you know, hug each other. And then there would be no deal, and which is, I think, you know, the best outcome, and he may lose interest and turn to other stuff. He's done that on many, many issues. So, you know, I think we could maybe hope for that. But right now, if you actually read what they're saying about this war, it's Alice in Wonderland. It is that the war was caused by Ukraine, that Ukraine was the aggressor. I mean, it's, you know, what can you say? This was the first major land war in Europe since World War II, 80 years attempt to grab another country. It's entirely in line with Russia's view from the very, very beginning, 15th century of Russian history, has always been that this country with these great flat areas on its borders, no natural barriers. And Russia has always, always, always felt vulnerable. And Catherine the Great said, "I know of no way to protect my borders but to enlarge them." She got it in one sentence, right? And the Russians have always felt that way, and they built this enormous sphere of influence within the USSR, which Putin has said over and over again he wants to recreate. Most of the old USSR is now inside NATO. I mean, we're in a scary time.
You've credited the Biden administration for its handling, for the most part, of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. Did Biden make any mistake, as some have suggested, by not giving or providing the arms that Ukraine would have needed to defeat Russia? Maybe that's too big a deal to even contemplate, but
You know,
what would have been the alternative?
More arms faster, but it wouldn't have made a difference. I mean, it wouldn't have changed the outcome of where we are. There might have been fewer Ukrainians killed. But you know, all the hullabaloo over F-16s, it takes forever to get the planes, get them configured right for that use, to train the pilots. There wasn't that much delay. The same is true with tanks. So, and with some of the anti-tank weapons. I think what has happened in Ukraine, which is a surprise, is that drones, combined with conventional artillery, have completely changed the battlefield. And that's really what's caused this stalemate.
And that's not just in Ukraine, I mean, that's a fact
That's
in the Middle East
true
as well,
everywhere.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
asymmetrical warfare is flourishing everywhere.
Yeah, and you know, these drones are things you can basically buy on Amazon. So, I don't think there is anything, looking back, that the Biden administration could have done in Ukraine that would have changed where we are today. Let me just say, I mean, what he did right is important, right? The first thing he did was to say there will be no U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. And he said it over and over and over again, which laid the basis for Americans to spend the money that we did spend and to do what we did do. And then he did lots and lots of things that are not really out in the open, right? Intelligence sharing, logistics sharing. There was a great big international, multinational military headquarters that worked on planning. And so there was lots and lots and lots of help. And intelligence sharing was, was really important. And also, he made public U.S. intelligence in a way that was really kind of first, unique, as a way to spike the Russian attempts to blame the war on somebody else, right? I mean, he made it clear, the Russian mobilization before the invasion happened, so there was no question where it was coming from, except for Donald Trump's money.
Briefly, you said that the administration could undo NATO from the inside. It would seem to the layperson that NATO is stronger than ever, 32 members now, greater commitment of financial support from the other member nations. How could he undo, or somebody undo, NATO from the inside?
Well, if he, in some way, in words, makes a deal with Putin, where some of the give is NATO troops outside the former Soviet Union, where he gives credibility and international acceptance to the idea of taking territory by force again. And we're back in pre-World War II world, which truly was 3 weeks ago. Was unthinkable that principle of international law could be questioned.
Okay. Jump around a little bit. Broadly speaking, what is China up to these days, and what must its leaders be thinking?
Well, China has certainly, in the last 15 years, 12 years, whatever, become much more aggressive, has really swept aside all the efforts to engage with the U.S. That had been ongoing, that has taken very aggressive moves in the South China Sea, taking these basically kind of little rocks and building them out into military bases, has questioned what's called the 9-dash line, which is a boundary that's set by the international law, the Sea Treaty, into areas that are claimed by several different countries, and has moved way back from where it was domestically, and is now, really the Communist Party has reasserted tight surveillance and control, and crackdown. I mean, just to give you an example, when I was president of Carnegie, we made a decision to try to become the world's first global think tank. And we had an office in Moscow, an office in Beijing, an office in Beirut, an office in Brussels, and we were building an office in New Delhi. And the ideas were that they would be staffed by local experts, and that the heart of the institution was Washington, but we would do collaborative research. And that it was in the U.S. interest to be able to hear the way others define issues. And we made, anyway, a year and a half ago, after 29 years, Putin shut down the Carnegie Moscow Center, which was a major institution in Russia. And our Beijing office is now not exactly dead, but virtually dead. And the Chinese scholars and professors who were working with us, who we were training how to do independent policy research, have been told not to do it anymore. The students that we had about 30 students a year who were interns in the office, who were learning, and who then were getting internships and graduate study in the U.S. They're gone. There's still a room, and so China has become vastly more shut down, and also much more aggressive in the region. It also has developed this partnership, which they announced as a no-limits partnership with Moscow. It clearly does have limits because the Chinese have refused to send troops or some certain kinds of weapons to Ukraine. And they apparently pulled Putin back from the threats he was making to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So there are limits in this relationship. Later today in Middleburg, we're having a talk about the Arctic. They have real collisions of interest in the Arctic and elsewhere. So, but there's no question that the China of today does not look like what it looked 15 years ago or remotely, either domestically or internationally. And, and the big question, or at least a huge question, is what is the lesson the Chinese have learned from Ukraine vis-a-vis Taiwan? Because, a hot conflict over Taiwan is so easy to imagine. And I don't want to say, it'll leave the impression that the U.S. has been error-free in this period. The U.S. has done lots of things wrong with both Russia and China, and an awful lot of bad stuff has flown from the invasion of Iraq. But China has changed direction, and I think, in part, we went through an awfully long period of time where our journals and scholarly work and newspapers were full of talk about regime change, right? And, we thought of it as yes and no. How aggressive should we be? When is it wise? Can you achieve meaningful regime change at the end of a gun? But to Russia and China, it sounds like the United States interested in invasion. So we have not been scot-free in what's happened in the last, and certainly what we did in Iraq underlined the fears and really changed things, of course, across the Middle East as well. But this is a very different China also. You know, I should say, going back to where we started from, about how domestic polarization and division weakens us. Both Russia and China really believed that the divisions that they could see in our domestic polity signaled the United States that was much weaker than it had been, and therefore encouraged thought and talk and planning about, in China's case, becoming the greatest military power, at least in Asia. So we looked weaker because of it, and we were weaker. We are weaker because we have now so much area of value and that we would never have questioned. That's now,
Yeah, for sale. I don't know.
yeah.
Well, let's jump to another happy topic, the Middle East.
Well, I think a great deal has flowed from the invasion of Iraq. None of it good. A great deal flows now from an Israeli government that has committed itself, well, that is being run by an individual whose sole interest is staying out of jail. Who has made common cause with the most right-wing members of the Israeli polity, whose idea of how to deal with the Palestinians who live inside Israel proper is to drive them out, is to make life intolerable, is to grab their land, to grab their possessions. There's no happy ending to that. There is none. You know, the irony of what Trump is talking about sending off the 2 million Palestinians who live in Gaza so that he can make a resort out of where would they go? Right? I mean, when Israel was created in 1948, there was no place for Palestinians, a couple of 100,000 to go. And there is no place now. And now, of course, worldwide, there is a much stronger commitment and recognition of the value of national homelands. The one foreign policy achievement, I think, of the Trump first administration was the so-called Abraham Accords. And the idea of the Abraham Accords was you could, these individual Arab countries would make peace with with Israel and ignore the Palestinians. And that worked when those were very small Arab countries. It's one thing when Oman does that. It's a whole different deal when Saudi Arabia is just about to do that. And when Saudi Arabia is just about to do that, the Palestinians said, no, right? This has to stop. This is our future. So the Abraham Accords are now on, but that was the premise, right? Which was that Trump could, quote, make peace and forge a peace in the Middle East between the Arab nations and Israel. And he had this great idea about being a Nobel Peace Prize winner and believed that he could force such a peace. But he left out the Palestinians. It's like leaving out the Afghan government when you go to make peace with, to try to make peace with the Taliban, or leaving out the Ukrainian government when you go to try to stop the war in Ukraine. It's just performance art.
You've talked a little bit about what has happened to the Carnegie Endowment. As we look around the world and the role that nonprofits have played, World Resources Institute, which you were a founding member, I believe, and Carnegie and others that are trying to do the good work, trying to present neutral policy information. What is the state of those institutions today?
Well, a lot of them are very, very are healthy in terms of the quality of the staff and in terms of and financially, but morale isn't so good. I am serving on a commission right now which is thinking about nuclear nonproliferation. Is this a moment when we have to rethink nonproliferation policy and stuff? Well, we started out a couple of months ago and recognizing some big changes in the world that needed to be kind of factored in. But our last meeting was 4 days ago, whatever. And you could barely speak, you could barely think, because all the foundation of the building you were working on, where you were maybe going to add a new wing or redesign the atrium or something, but the foundation is gone. So, what do you? So it's and for the organizations, the many organizations that are working domestically, and I think this will happen also internationally, have this triage job to do, which is the first thing they have to figure out is this announcement just diversionary, right? Let's get everybody thinking about the Gulf of America while we do this. So is it diversionary? Is it a policy that is, we think, dangerous or wrong or repulsive, but not existential? Or is it existential to democracy? That's what these organizations are grappling with. And it's not easy because it's, the problem with Trump has always been, people laughing and supporters saying, don't take that seriously, he doesn't mean that really, that's just talk. But it turns out he does mean it, so it's not, you may have heard, AP has lost its place in the presidential pool, 13 news organizations, which it has had for 100 and something years, because they have said they're going to call it the Gulf of Mexico. And obviously the organizations like CLC, that's run by Trevor Potter, one of our neighbors, and others that are working just straight on elections and the sort of institutional base of democracy. They are doing this triage on a daily basis, and it's very, very good to see, to make those calls, and also to see around the corner. I mean, it was bad enough when Hegseth got confirmed, but then, you did not expect carnage in the Joint Chiefs staff, or the firing of the JAGs. This is really scary. We still don't know whether the Supreme Court will stand up and draw a line at a lot of the things that are going to come their way soon. But at least Trump can't fire judges at will. He could fire the JAGs, right? He could fire the inspector generals. So I think it's pretty clear he's going to go after the judiciary to the extent he can. I'm sorry.
No, good answers. I'm going to switch gears again, if I may, and just ask you to tell us a little bit about your journey, what you thought as a young person, what led you to this career. I mean, you were a scientist, and you still are a scientist, and you have said that scientists ought to play a much greater role in public policy if the world would be a better place. But what influenced you, and how did you get here?
I always thought in high school that science was the most interesting, was the primary intellectual, starting with math, but I could never have been a mathematician. But the primary intellectual, the thing that got you closest to what makes the universe tick, and so I majored in molecular biology in college, and then I went to graduate school. But as I was finishing graduate school, my mother was an historian. Her family had all been in government. I had a great uncle who was Secretary of the Treasury, and another who was the New York District Attorney, and so that was sort of part of the family environment I grew up in. And so I was always interested in government and policy and stuff. And just as I was finishing my PhD, I couldn't sleep. I stopped being able to sleep, and I didn't know for the first time in my life. I didn't know why. And it was because part of me couldn't believe that I was going to spend the rest of my life in the lab. And I was the only person I knew who read the newspaper. I mean, none of my friends in the lab did. And it started to feel like that wasn't really, even though I just put in 5 years of PhD work and undergraduate. So I applied for a White House fellowship. It was the height of the Nixon paranoia year. I got to the individual interview, and one of the interviewers said, "Tuckman, are you related to?" And so I decided to take some time off, and I went to work for a wonderful congressman named Mo Udall, who was running for president. Actually, I got something called a Congressional Science Fellowship, a fellowship to work for 1 year as an advisor in Congress, the first year they had them. And I went to work for Mo, and I never got back to the lab. And I ended up where I belonged.
How and why did you end up here in Fauquier?
The answer to that question, as so many things are, is 2 words: Mary Ritter. She was a close friend of my mother's family, And she invited me to go riding with her. That was my other great passion for many, many, many years. And we rode across the land I later bought that she saved. That's called the Old Texas Farm. You know, I think of her practically every day when I look out the window. But for 25 years it was just weekends, and it was all riding and gardening, and I didn't know anybody here, and I didn't have any life here. And then I started, you know, I live here now, so that's a really different thing.
It is a good thing. Briefly, before we turn it over to the audience, your involvement with the Piedmont Journalism Foundation, why and what have you learned?
Well, PJF is the nonprofit owner of the Fauquier Times and the Prince William Times. I spent time on the editorial board of the Washington Post. I believe the free, professional, healthy media is essential to a democracy. I'm kind of with Thomas Jefferson on that. You had to choose between the legislature and media, choose the media. And so some years ago, Piedmont Media, which was then the for-profit owner of these for-profit entities, got the idea that the answer, as it turns out, really is nonprofit ownership, which allows you to raise money, tax-deductible money from individuals and from foundations, because right now that's the only way to stay alive financially. So Trevor Potter asked me if I would join a three-person board. George Gilbert sitting back there was one of them, and Bo Jones, who used to be the publisher of the Washington Post. Three of us were the board of this entity. Eventually we merged with the other board, and so it's now a wholly nonprofit ownership. And that has been very successful. You know, I keep thinking we're going to get to a point where it's sort of, you know, but it's still like this. We're running up a down escalator, is what we're doing, because the financial situation for media, especially local media across the country, is awful. And the country has lost 2.5 a week of local newspapers over the last decade. So there are these big news deserts all over the country. And this would have been another one had it not been for this group of really dedicated people that got together now about, I don't know, 12 years ago to try to save the paper. And now a quarter of our budget now is philanthropic from individuals and foundations, and that's obviously
You see that mix going up.
yes. And but we're healthy, and we have a huge issue here, which is the data centers and what's happening and what's going to happen. Because I think what we're going to realize pretty soon is that our little 40 acres here is going to be the least of it, and that there is I think it's something of a fantasy, but there is a view among the owners of the data centers, the builders of them, that demand just has to go up at something like 3 or 4% a year, and that's going to require nuclear reactors all over the place. And the numbers are, I think, fantasy. I don't think there's any way in the world that they can be built at the rate and to meet the demand that they're talking about. But it would certainly, and the question of who decides is between local governments, state governments, federal government, why ratepayers should pay the cost of this vast new infrastructure for entities that are making gigantic profits. Huge profits. I think everybody here knows that, and we don't know. This is one of the things that really gets me because we don't know the answer to this. Why did Amazon pay so much more than the asking price for those 40 acres? Who does that? If somebody says, I need $50 for that sweater, and you say, fine, I'd like to give you $400. We don't have, anyway. They have enormous profit margins. All of Amazon's financial health comes from these things, not from its retail business. So we're going to be looking at huge issues. And just sort of one final word about the importance of it. It has always been the case that local newspapers, local news, is the most trusted part of the media universe because the news that they cover is so immediate, so local. The people can judge whether they're getting, honest, and that has built trust in, national and larger. So I think it's enormously important that we make a success out of these two newspapers, figure out a way to change to run up the down escalator and to deal with these, issues that will determine what this place is like to live in.
My view is that we need more reporters everywhere. Is the foundation addressing that?
Well, I am in the midst of trying to raise money specifically for a bigger project even than we've done on the data center issue writ large, on energy, and so I'm starting to look at some national foundations, and that will allow us to increase the, but as you probably know, besides people, and we're lucky here because there's all kinds of talent, retired talent that's really terrific in this neighborhood. But the other big problem is the cost of paper and printing.
So how long will you do that?
And well, I don't know. I'm one of, what do they call it? Of people who like to change early, first adapter, right? I really miss my paper newspapers, I must say. I know I don't read online the way I used to read paper. But anyway, the tariffs, if they go into effect against Canada, will raise the price of paper by 25%, and then
Try to get in, I was bad on two counts. Try to get in a couple of audience questions.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that we have gone so long.
should we take a couple?
We'll take a couple. They're going to be really good. Really thoughtful.
We'd like for you to use the microphone so we get recorded.
Of all the people who are advising Trump, excluding Musk, whose causes you the most concern?
I have no idea. I really don't. It would be a very long list, but there's not one.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If you were sworn in today as president, tomorrow, on the stage of international relations, foreign policy, etc., things that are broken, what would be the first thing you would fix?
Are you talking about things he's done or things that I thought were broken pre?
I mean, things that you would think today are broken, and you had the ability to fix them. What would you fix?
Well, I mean, the first things I would do would be to undo a good deal of what he's done. But I don't think that's your question. We did need an end to the Ukraine war, both on its own merits, but also because nothing else that we need to do with Russia, notably nuclear arms control, can move ahead until we find some. You know, Lou asked me earlier, did Biden do a pretty good job on Ukraine? And I think, you know, all things considered, he did. But one thing that we did much too slowly was the sanctions on, the economic sanctions on Russia. They are starting to hurt. And I think that there are additional steps that could be taken to tighten the noose more that would accelerate the moment when we could begin to have meaningful negotiations.
Thank you. This has been really interesting. My question is, what role do you think the UN could play as a strategic partner in this moment in time? Because in the first administration, I feel like Secretary General Guterres was quite, he worked hard to foster a good working relationship, and Trump seemed to enjoy his time at the UN. But obviously with what's happened in the last 3 weeks, I mean, it's probably a step that no one at the UN could even have imagined. So what role do you think they can play now? And also understanding, I think that there will be a new Secretary General halfway through this administration.
My guess is that the role for the UN to come back to being a major player would be through the individual agencies. If we have another pandemic, which is not that unlikely at this point with bird flu, it will be WHO and seeing the damage that U.S. pulling out has done that, you know, will help to highlight the role of. And so I think, you know, that a number of this is the third maybe green shoot to talk about, which is, I think an awful lot of what they're trying to do is going to fail spectacularly. And, you know, the question is when, how soon? And unfortunately, certainly the damage he's doing to global efforts to slow climate change won't happen, won't be cleared soon enough. But some other things will, and it will be in the specialized agencies, I think.
Who or what can prevent nuclear testing to be starting back again?
Unfortunately, I don't think anything. I think if the president orders a return, there will be lots and lots of writing and speaking of people who say what I said, which is this is a policy that will benefit only China and proliferators and bring us nothing. But you know, there are some things Congress can do, but this isn't if it were to wake up. But this isn't one of them. This is within the president's purview. Did you have a question?
You obviously have a great wealth of knowledge and understanding of the situation, and at the first of your talk said you were terrified, as many of us probably are as well in the room. I wonder, with all of the knowledge that you have, if you could impart or share some things, some practical nuts and bolts things that we could, the terrified among us, could actually do. You know, I think that's part of the terror is that we feel we are powerless. And with all your knowledge and all the wisdom you have, you know, could you suggest some things that the little people here, you know, us, all of us, you know, could really do at this time to help our country?
I mean, the best answer I have, and the only one that I myself am following, is to pick half a dozen of the very best NGOs that you know of who are fighting back and support them. I mean, I've enormously increased my gifts to Campaign Legal Center, to the ACLU, to the Southern Property Law Center, and there are a bunch of others that are, and I think people in this room know of them, that are more directly fighting back. And, you know, it's going to take an awful lot of money to fight these things through the courts. And, you know, and then, this is an unsatisfactory answer, but it's where I'm at too, which is, you know, crawling out from under the covers. At least I have sort of, since November 5th, you know, I sort of glance at the headlines and I can't bear it really, but I'm getting better. And beginning to sort of, and I think that's what we all have to do is, and once we do, we will find groups, nonprofits that are getting together to fight back, and we will have to, you know, especially try to make clear where the payment starts to come. Food prices go up, as you know, what happened, and I guess another area is trying to, that's really local, is to try to help the people who are at risk from these deportations to the extent that we can. And there are, again, groups that have, you know, put together Spanish language materials that tell people what their rights are and how to deal with what, you know, could happen. As always, it's sort of, you know, brick by brick. And I think it will be incumbent on everybody to, as these contradictions become evident, the price of food, the effects on employment for the restaurant industry, for the hospitality industry, for the construction industry. I was meeting with somebody the other day about problems with my geothermal system, and he said, my team that does digging is gone. I said, what do you mean, gone? He said, they've been working for me for 15 years, they've all gone back, they gathered their families and went back to our mom. And, you know, this was last week here. And so, all politics is local, so we can fight through NGOs at the national level, and we can act, you know, one by one here. It's not fully satisfactory.
How about supporting local elections at the state, you know, our
Congress people and our state elected officials. There are a lot of elections coming up this year, and I think it's important to support good candidates and everybody vote and encourage people to vote.
Absolutely.
That should be obvious, but it's easy to say I can't do anything and just give up, which we shouldn't do.
Fully agree.
Last question.
Thank you for the nice speech or the discussion. My concern is the free press. I mean, knowledge is power. I heard today that NASA now will only give information out through X. I know that the NBC was first kicked out of the White House and then AP. I'm worried about private ownership of papers and Sinclair and Fox. And I'm worried that the media isn't as robust as it should be. And what can we do to ensure that we're getting all the news? Because it seems to be there's some suppression going on. So what do we do?
I completely agree. I would recommend one of the very best pieces that I had read in the last couple of months was a piece by a woman named Masha Gessen, Gessen, in the New York Times about 10 days ago. A lengthy, maybe it was in the Times magazine, I'm not sure. But Masha is a Russian emigre, very smart, very tough, and she talks about how autocracies root themselves in unfamiliar territory. And she quotes Timothy Schneider, who's the great historian of European autocracy, who talks about, I think the phrase is anticipatory obedience. That trying to curry favor by doing things you think that the ruler will like in advance, in fact, enormously doesn't end up saving you, but enormously smooths the way for them and accelerates the. I read this, I got an email from a niece of mine who works for the State Department in their Foreign Visitors Bureau, where they do programs for visitors to the U.S., and they expect to be shut down. But somebody has just put forward a new project of bringing people here to study Christian politics, lessons from America today, or lessons from American Example today, or something. There's an awful lot of, and it's all over the media too. The Washington Post has just done some horrible, horrible stuff. This anticipatory obedience. And I think, some of the best things I have read over the last couple of months have been either by Russians or about Russia, because they see so clearly this. And of course, the media is an essential. I mean, what do you need to have a democracy? You need to have competent, accountable government. You need to have a professional civil service. You can't run a complicated government without one. You need to have an impartial judiciary. You need to have a functioning legislature. You need to have a free press. And, if you go through that list, he's going at all of them. And I think part of the answer to your question is we've all got to be focus on understanding that and hoping that the country will begin to see and reject stuff that is so profoundly anti-American. And, you know, I canceled my Washington Post subscription. We need to take whatever steps we can to send a message that we don't like what's, you know, and that I get things, offers to resubscribe at better and better prices every 2 or 3 days. But, so they are aware, I fear it, you know, there is no magic answer to your question. I think we're all striving for those answers, other than, you know, beginning to begin as informed as we possibly can, that we can stomach, and, you know, providing money and individual support and votes, you know, to the extent we can, and being as involved on local issues as we can. I think there's going to be, I think, a big announcement tomorrow about nuclear power in Virginia that where, you know, we are a public, and government has to respond. So, but awareness about what's happening to media is, again, something we all have to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica and Lou. It's always a pleasure. Just a couple of announcements. Can you hear me okay? I don't think I need a microphone. First, if you would fill this out, we do value them at the library, the information about how you found out about it and other suggestions, excuse me, that you might have for future speakers. But with that in mind, April 2nd, we have a series sponsored by the Barbara and Keith Severin Lecture Series, and it's Patrick O'Donnell, who is the author of The Unvanquished. He is an author who has written 11 or 12 books, primarily a war historian. This happens to be about the Mosby Rangers, and so most of the book setting takes place in and around Fauquier County. And so there's a lot of local connection to this particular book, and we're looking forward to having him for this April 2nd lecture sponsored by the Severin family. But on May the 4th, back here in the John Barton Paint Building, which we hope by May the 4th will have its new, as I've mentioned over the course of the last several conversations, we have raised the money for this 100-year-old building to do some renovation, which will include enhanced audiovisual and darkening capability so that we could show audiovisuals in this room. And so to kick that hopefully remodeled room off, Sonny Reynolds, who is here today, will be doing a travel lecture. Sonny has been running a travel company for the last 25 or 30 years?
35.
Something like that. And has literally been all over the world and to many of the places as many as 25, 30 times. Was a professional photographer before her travel business, and so she not only has been to all of these places, she has exquisite photographs. So we'll be having her on May the 4th. And then September 10th is the community read. Linda Rutledge, West with the Giraffes, will be another lecture sponsored by the library. That will be at Highland School. And the book, I actually read it in anticipation of this, and it's interesting. Again, the giraffes, it's based on a true story, and the giraffes are taken across the country, but they do move through Fauquier County, and so there's a loose connection to our area in this story as well. But it's a fascinating story, and if you're not familiar with it, this is a book that the entire community is encouraged to read, and then we have the author come and be available. And so there's school children reading it, and book clubs, and hundreds of people, hopefully, in the community reading the same book. So that will be in September 10th. But if you would turn in these at the door, that would be helpful. And thank you again, Jessica and Lou.